I'm just hopping in front of the camera here, partly because I know that I have a somewhat larger audience for my video blog than I do for my written blog. And since you can see the numbers that I get with the video blog, you can imagine how small the numbers are with the written one. But I've made a major discovery, and it's very frustrating to me because basically there's nobody to tell, seemingly. Um, this has to do with Charles Dickens and his first popular work, the Pickwick Papers, which was released in serial form initially. And this is something that basically I've learned fairly recently, and I'm working here without any notes and like 5 minutes preparation. So I may not be able to just pull all the facts right out of my head, but I'll give you the gist of what I understand of what actually went down with this thing. And that is that the illustrator, Robert Seymour, who was famous at the time and really had aspirations to be an artist, he just sort of did caricatures for a living, but he really wanted to be an artist. And he had the idea for what to him I think was going to be a master work about the Pickwick Club. And it was going to be social satire, a satire on the upper classes, I think. And he was going to write it and do the illustrations both. This was in 1835. And he already had like several illustrations and I think a complete outline of the thing. And he had shown it to a couple publishers and he'd shown it privately to some friends. And but he apparently was very much under the gun in terms of work pressure, and he got sick. He got seriously ill and realized he wasn't going to have time to write this thing. So he decided he would let somebody else basically ghostwrite it for him and he would do the illustrations. So that's the background of this. His wife, Jane, was apparently his literary agent and his advisor in worldly matters. And somehow or other they hooked up with the publishers Chapman and Hall. I don't remember exactly how that introduction occurred. And Chapman and Hall had heard of this fellow Boz, which is Charles Dickens, and his sketches. And they gave Seymour, Robert Seymour, samples from sketches, a couple volumes of sketches. And that was samples. And he took it home and he just kind of handed it to Jane because she handled all these things for him and he was very busy. So he said, dear, would you look at these and make a decision on whether we should hire this fellow? She didn't like them. They bothered her. I think that they were too cynical, and especially when they got to be cynical about the church, that she was offended because she was a Christian. But she also understood that Dickens was very poor and she felt sorry for him. And so she advised her husband to go ahead and use him because it would really help him out financially. And then what happened was that Dickens took over and he had the backing of the publishers and his ideas would have been much more commercially viable than Robert Seymour's ideas. He would appeal to the public. That was Charles Dickens' personal genius, was to titillate the public. And he could sell, see? And they could see that that was going to sell. So the publisher backed up Dickens, and Dickens took over the project and insisted on inserting another story that Seymour didn't want, Robert Seymour. And Jane kind of convinced him to go ahead and do it, I guess being conciliatory. And Robert did an illustration, and Dickens either didn't like it or wanted a second illustration. He wanted it for free. And Robert got so fed up that he shot himself, killed himself. That's what I understand from her own testimony, because she just kept quiet about it, and she would ask Dickens for help, and he would ignore her. He wouldn't help her out financially. And finally, he wouldn't really give her the time of day, apparently. And then she found out that Dickens, was lying about what had happened, making it look like almost the whole thing had been his original ideas. So at that point, she wrote I guess like a 21-page statement and published it, explaining everything that I just said and maybe a little bit more, but basically explaining how the thing went down. And she said that they didn't have the term sociopath back then, which is what I've been calling Dickens the last year or so when I became convinced of it. But she called him a sociopath, a liar, and he was inhumane, but there was a lot of little tidbits in there. One of them was that she had heard rumors, and when Jane Seymour hears rumors, she's not talking about down at the laundromat or the pub or whatever they had, down at the street corner, the ladies gossiping. She's talking about the literati of London that she knows. She has good connections. She had heard of at least two authors that Charles Dickens had plagiarized. And one of them supposedly was dying, she had heard. And from her testimony, it sounds like she had heard of several that each of these people had been writing that Dickens had stolen. So there was rumors of Charles Dickens being a massive plagiarist, and there were rumors of him being inhumane and doing things that she apparently was too delicate to mention. And there were other people that she cited that were of the same opinion, that he was amoral, basically. So it wasn't just her, and it certainly wasn't just me. It means that there was quite a buzz out there about Charles Dickens' personal character and the fact that he was massively plagiarizing and that he was not a nice guy. But anyway, as soon as her statement, this is firsthand testimony now of what occurred with her and her husband, as soon as it came out, the pro-Dickens apologists jumped all over it. And they basically, I don't know if they went and bought up all the copies and burned them or what, but only 2 copies have survived of that original printing. This would have been 1854, somewhere between 1850 and 1854, as I understand. So there was only a couple copies left floating around, and apparently right about the turn of the century, around 1900, one of these copies surfaced. And the people who the next year formed the Dickens Fellowship figured they'd better act fast. And what they did was they published it themselves, but they published it with a huge preface trying to discredit everything that she'd said. They basically made her out to look ignorant and dishonest and neurotic and every other slur they could possibly think of to discredit her. And then they claimed that there were all kinds of mistakes and discrepancies in her testimony, with footnotes and everything. But I followed them. I traced them down. And where there's a discrepancy, it's just like, well, maybe there was something she quoted and there was a superfluous sentence and she left that out. Or she made 2 paragraphs when there was 1, or vice versa, or had semicolons where there were commas. In other words, she didn't misrepresent anything. They misrepresented her completely. They smeared her. And Dickens had done this before with other people. If anybody dared cross him, he would smear their reputation completely, make them look like, fools or idiots or con artists or criminals or something. So, and Dickens also did this with regard to the affair with Ellen Ternan that he was actually having. He wrote a similar bullshit letter about that. It's called by historians the violated letter. We know he actually did have the affair, so I recommend to everybody to read the violated letter to get some sense, some compass on just how big a bullshitter Charles Dickens was. Well, he bullshitted with regard to what Jane Seymour had said also. He did that in the preface to the Pickwick Papers when he published it as a book. He told this, outrageous lie about how he supposedly had created the whole thing himself almost, and Robert Seymour had very little to do with it, and he painted Robert Seymour as kind of a hack caricature illustrator who was only interested in sporting type things like fishing and hunting and stuff like that. Total mischaracterization of the man. The truth is that he was a brilliant, a genius, and he was a man of social conscience, and he had planned this as a masterwork, and Dickens came in and took over and dumbed it down exactly as I had already determined he did with A Christmas Carol. Same modus operandi. Get somebody else's work, commercialize it, popularize it, and make big bucks off it by having dumbed it down and watered it down for the public. That's what I already knew he'd done with A Christmas Carol. That's what he did with Robert Seymour's planned masterpiece, The Pickwick Papers, and it sold like hotcakes. But it sold because Robert Seymour was already famous and his name was on it. That's why it sold. That's what Jane Seymour tells us. So Charles Dickens kind of piggybacked on Robert Seymour's fame and then made him out to be a nobody and made himself out to be the genius, see? And so what I see in this is that everything in her statement is accurate, and Jane is an intelligent, educated woman. She's being completely honest in this statement, and she doesn't even want to say these things, but she felt forced to come out publicly and say them. The exact opposite of what the person that wrote the preface infers. He infers that this thing had preyed on her mind and she went crazy and she's making up all these lies and smearing Dickens and slandering him and so on, when it's exactly the opposite, you know. So I don't know who to tell. I mean, this is known. It's just that it's completely marginalized. Nobody takes it seriously. So they know about it as kind of a footnote to history, but they don't take any of it seriously. Well, they should be taking it seriously because every word that Jane Seymour says in there, I think, is authentic. If she's made any mistakes, they were honest mistakes, you know, but I haven't found any. The only thing I found, like I said, is that where she quotes something, she might leave out part of a sentence that wasn't really necessary, you know. That's the kind of error that Jane Seymour made. Everything else in it is completely accurate, you know. It means that Charles Dickens was a sociopath. And it's always a huge shock for anybody to face a massive liar like that, because sociopaths and psychopaths don't lie in a normal way. They tell the big lie, the outrageous brass balls lie, see? And if people believe that, then in order to, and that's why they tell one like that, because, you know, in order to turn that around, to flip that around, you have to believe this guy was a complete and utter phony, see? An imposter. Charles Dickens was an imposter, you know, and it's the same for some of the other ones that ripped off Mathew and Abby Whittier. But just sticking with Charles Dickens, you know, this guy was a phony, okay? But now, some 150, 180 years later, now there's these huge organizations that have built up around Charles Dickens, and there's academicians who have built their entire careers around him, that wrote their PhD dissertation on him and have published books about him and have been teaching for 20 or 30 years. And it's all a myth. It's all a lie. All of it. You know, it's a huge house of cards. So who's going to take that seriously? You know, well, I don't know, but I'm trying to get Mathew and Abby Whittier's true legacy established. See, so I have to challenge these things. Okay, so I mean, Jane Seymour's testimony, if you take it literally, if you don't discredit her, if you believe her, is absolutely damning, and it absolutely dovetails with what I had already concluded about the way Charles Dickens stole A Christmas Carol. So there you have it. I tell everybody that I can think of. I'm basically ignored by everyone. I don't know how many people that watch this blog. We're talking 25, I think, for the last one. You know, that's how many people in the whole world I can get to even watch a little bit of these blog entries. How many of those 25 take me seriously, you know, and how many are just watching because I'm kind of a weird duck that's interesting to look at for 5 minutes? You know, I don't know. But this is real.